Okay, let's dive right into this. If you've been glancing at the international headlines lately, you've definitely seen the incredibly explosive war of words going on between Turkey and Israel. I mean, the rhetoric coming from both sides right now is hostile, it's escalating, and frankly, it's got a lot of folks pretty nervous about a brand new conflict erupting in what's already a hyper volatile region. But what's actually happening beneath all that noise? Today, we're going to separate the loud political posturing from the cold, hard geopolitical reality. I know international relations can sometimes feel like this massive, intimidating iceberg, but don't worry, we're going to break this down into bite-sized, logical pieces so you can understand exactly what's going on. To do that, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the war of words, trace the roller coaster diplomatic history, and look at the Syrian power vacuum. Then, we'll map out the competing regional alliances, uncover the domestic political game, and finally, ask the big question, are they heading for actual conflict? All right, Section 1. The War of Words. Before we can dig into the underlying causes, we really have to acknowledge the sheer hostility of this surface-level rhetoric. For example, according to an analysis in Foreign Policy, former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett bluntly labeled Turkey as the new Iran. Now, that is a massive statement to make. The analysis suggests he needs a big threat to run against in upcoming elections, but sparking claims in the Turkish media that Turkey might actually be Israel's next target, that's a huge escalation in language. And the current leadership is just as fierce. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu recently went so far as to label Turkish President Erdogan an anti-Semitic dictator. Meanwhile, on the Turkish side, the rhetoric is just as fiery. Turkish officials have publicly called for the liberation of Jerusalem. They've accused Israel of committing genocide in Gaza, strongly backed South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice, and even warned that Israeli strikes in neighboring countries are a direct threat to Turkey itself. So what's really driving all of this? Well, beneath this dramatic war of words is a literal, high-stakes tug-of-war for regional hegemony. And by that, I mean both of these states are actively seeking to expand their influence and establish absolute dominance over their geographic neighbors. You see, the geopolitical balance of power in the Middle East has completely shifted. Both Turkey and Israel are looking at a massive opportunity to fill the vacuum left behind by a weakened Iran and a U.S. that seems to be pulling back a bit from the region. Simply put, they both want to be the dominant player. Moving right along to Section 2, a roller coaster diplomatic history. To truly grasp how we arrived at this historic low, we need to take a quick step back. Did you know Turkey was actually the first Muslim-majority country to recognize Israeli sovereignty way back in 1949? But man, it hasn't been smooth sailing since. By 2010, ties had completely collapsed following the Gaza war and Israel's deadly raid on a Turkish aid flotilla. But here's the fascinating part. By 2022, they actually rebounded. Full diplomatic ties were restored, and they were even talking about joint energy projects in the Mediterranean. Fast forward to post-October 7th, though, and relations collapsed entirely. The Gaza war completely unraveled all that progress, leading Erdogan to fully cut trade ties with Israel. Which brings us to Section 3, the Syrian power vacuum. You see, this feud isn't just about Gaza. It is fundamentally about the deep geopolitical battlegrounds right next door. A massive pivot point happened with the collapse of the Assad regime in late 2024. That event created a huge regional power vacuum and completely scrambled the geopolitical board. The transition to a new regional order centered right on Syria, and both Israel and Turkey instantly scrambled to consolidate their influence in this new post-Assad reality. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast in their competing visions. On one hand, Turkey has closely allied itself with the new Syrian government led by President Ahmed al-Shar. Erdogan's desired outcome here is a strong, stable Syria unified under al-Shar, and Turkey has really carved out a dominant role in the post-war reconstruction. On the polar opposite side, Israel is deeply suspicious of al-Shar's Islamist roots. Their main focus? Containment. Israel has seized strategic territory in southern Syria. They plan to stay there indefinitely. And they're actively launching military incursions and striking targets, actions they state are necessary to protect Druze civilians. So we're looking at two completely opposed strategies playing out in the exact same country. That leads us to Section 4, competing regional alliances. Because they aren't just fighting for influence in Syria, they're aggressively building rival coalitions across the entire map to corner each other. On one side, we have what's being called Israel's hexagonal alliance architecture, which means reaching out to countries like Greece, Cyprus, and India. On the flip side, we have Turkey's Eastern outreach, where they are heavily boosting economic and military ties with Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. Now, Israel adding a European dimension by partnering with Greece and Cyprus, that is incredibly troubling for Turkey. Why? Well, because Turkey has intense, deep-seated territorial disputes and mutual suspicions with Greece and Cyprus over the Aegean Sea. And this brilliantly illustrates how these alliances are actively being weaponized. Israel, Greece, and Cyprus aren't just talking, they've formed a trilateral defense and energy bloc, with Greece and Cyprus actually purchasing advanced Israeli weapon systems. In response, Turkey is countering with massive infrastructure plays. They just signed an agreement with Saudi Arabia for a massive railway linking the two countries via Syria and Jordan, extending all the way down to Oman. Israel sees this railway as a direct attempt to curb their influence and bypass Israeli east-west trade corridors. It's literally a giant economic and military chess match.
Let's dive deeper with Section 5, the domestic political game.
To truly understand this geopolitical iceberg, we've got to look below the water at the hidden domestic motives driving this international feud. Both leaders are actively utilizing the threat of the other for their own domestic political survival. For Netanyahu, framing Turkey and its allies as an emerging radical Sunni axis serves a clear domestic electoral strategy, especially when parties are fighting to prove who's the strongest on security. Analysts point out that the perpetual threat of war is actually seen as central to his political survival. On the flip side, Erdogan is making a very calculated regional play. With Iran weakened, he's rhetorically upping the ante on Israel to position Turkey as a key center of influence in the Arab world, one that's capable of keeping Israel in check.
And then, we have this wild card, the Trump factor. Recent reports indicate some pretty heated phone calls between Trump and Netanyahu. Yet at the same time, Trump has publicly praised Erdogan, calling him a very good friend. In fact, Erdogan's regime has seemingly been spared the military and rhetorical wrath that Trump has directed at other NATO and European leaders over the Iran war. This dynamic gives Turkey some really unique rhetorical cover. Erdogan can essentially exploit these perceived tensions between the US and Israel to push the envelope even further.
Finally, Section 6, heading for actual conflict? Which brings us to our final and definitely most pressing question. When you look at all these arms sales, the border incursions in Syria, the severed trade, and leaders literally calling each other existential threats, are Israel and Turkey actually heading for a hot war? Well, the crucial answer is probably not. There are some massive structural realities that severely disincentivize any actual military confrontation. First off, they are unusually connected. Both are major allies of the United States. Plus, Turkey is a NATO member, which adds a massive, massive layer of complexity to any direct attack. Interestingly enough, both countries also share really good terms with Azerbaijan, which acts as a highly effective diplomatic backchannel to sort of cool things down behind closed doors. And finally, Donald Trump has maintained that because of his mutual respect with Erdogan, he simply won't let anything actually happen between the two while he's president. So, simply put, the rhetoric just doesn't match the reality. A direct war benefits neither party.
But here is what you should truly take away from this explainer. The real danger here isn't a declared war. It's accidental miscalculation. When you have two heavily armed nations aggressively jockeying for territory in places like Syria, building rival military alliances, and whipping their domestic bases into a frenzy with hostile rhetoric, the margin for error basically disappears. Even if a hot war isn't the primary goal, could this perpetual tug-of-war spark an accidental fire that neither side can put out? That is a huge risk the entire region is currently forced to live with. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep your eyes on the chessboard.